Well, Putin is someone who believed in rational choice theory. Rational choice theory says that if you give people the opportunity to make a decision, they will always be rational. They will always choose something, some option, whether it's in politics, economics, doesn't make any difference, that it aligns with their own personal best interests. Well, that's not true. People are not rational. People are irrational. That's the problem with all the rational choice theory and analysis. And Putin, when he began this thing, imputed rationality to us. When he first entered Ukraine, he was absolutely convinced that after 15, 16 years of telling us repeatedly, don't move NATO's boundary closer to Russia, don't militarize our neighbors against us, we won't tolerate hostile nations on our borders, and especially we will not tolerate a Ukraine that is hostile to Russia and a base of operations against us. He said, well, if I move into Ukraine with, at the time he had about 200,000 troops, and he initially went in with 90,000 on a very broad front. And he gave explicit orders, avoid collateral damage, don't harm civilians, give the Ukrainians a chance to surrender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He thought that as soon as he demonstrated his seriousness with military power, that Washington and its allies would say, now, wait a minute. Let's stop. We don't want this to become a larger war. We need to talk, because that was, in his estimation, the rational response. So he miscalculated. What he got instead was the opposite, where Washington was actually goading him, if you will, or baiting him into going into Ukraine. They were delighted he went in because they reached the erroneous conclusion that this was their opportunity to destroy Russia, to mire it in this endless war that would sap them of strength and so forth. So he went along for a while, and then when it became clear, when Boris Johnson showed up very suddenly in April and said, look, Mr. Zelensky, you can't make a deal. Don't accept neutrality. We will stand behind you. We will give you everything you need. You will have the total scientific industrial strength of the United States and its allies behind you. You're going to win. I think Zelensky believed it. And I mean, honestly, why wouldn't he, given the track record of the last 50, 60 years? But everyone miscalculated, what Russia would do. And Russia had to make a change in strategy. They couldn't go on with this small force and expect to get anywhere. So they went over to the strategic defense. They occupied the areas that are populated by Russians in southern Ukraine. They built up these defenses. They consolidated their position. And to their surprise, when they invited the Ukrainians to attack them, the Ukrainians were stupid enough to do so. And so starting in November, December, all the way until really within the last week or so, the Ukrainians have hurled tens of thousands of troops and thousands of tanks and guns and so forth at these defenses. So the strategy of defense has worked. But the problem now is that Putin understands that it doesn't seem to make any difference to people in the West. It doesn't matter how many Ukrainians die. They don't seem to care. He thought that they would be as horrified by this as he is. He wants an end to the war. He still wants to negotiate. No one in Washington is prepared to do that, and everyone is stonewalling him. And even worse, there's some evidence now that the Poles, Lithuanians may be interested in some sort of intervention that they claim they would execute on their own without being part of NATO. And this is absurd because they are in NATO. And if they go into Western Ukraine, they will be treated as NATO forces. This opens up Poland, Lithuania, and anyone else who may join this insanity to being attacked by the Russians. You recall that just about a week and a half ago, the Russians attacked this port of Reni on the river that separates Romania from Ukraine. And this particular port was devastated by hypersonic missiles and drones and so forth. And everyone was horrified. They said, this is right on the border with Romania. Well, that was the point. The Russians were trying to say, look, you cross this border and you go into Ukraine. This is what's going to happen to you. So here we sit and we're trying to figure out, what are we going to do? And Jake Sullivan says he wakes up every day and is trying to find more artillery ammunition because we have no more. And we can't produce anymore, and he's trying to ramp it up. Well, under those circumstances, does it make sense to continue to ask Ukrainians to die by the thousands? And a friend of mine who is in a position to watch all of this from space-based surveillance tells me that the battlefields are littered with Ukrainian dead. They can't even pick them up anymore. or
Jeez.
they're not bothering to do so. The
Wow.
hospitals are full of broken soldiers who will never return to active duty. And no one really knows how many have died, but the estimates are about 300,000 to 350,000 dead.
Jeez
And of
Louise.
course, Ukraine, people continue to leave. We now think 14 million people have left Ukraine. That leaves maybe 18 million,
Wow.
depending upon how you want to calculate it. This is a catastrophe. Ukraine is being destroyed. So, when is someone going to step forward and say, for humanitarian reasons, if nothing else, this must end? Others have decided, well, we're going to surrender. And the Russians have always treated Ukrainian soldiers very well, in contrast to the way Ukrainians have treated Russian soldiers. So this is a disaster. We should see the facts, make the right choice. But this statement, "Make peace, you fools," was actually lifted from a German general in 1944 after the landings at Normandy in the summer. And this four-star German general was asked by Hitler and others, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? He said, "Make peace, you fools." That's the answer. He was correct. That's what should happen now. But even worse, if you look at the broader world condition, Russia has always had the ability, thanks to its alliance with China and its friends all over the world, and they have huge numbers of friends right now. There are lots of people cheering on Russia. We're in the minority in terms of support. They can escalate horizontally. So in Africa, for instance, in Niger and other countries in what we call Afrique du Nord, French Northwest Africa, these states are effectively throwing the French out. They're staging coups and putting in governments that are now friendly to Russia and anti-Western. And in the case of Niger, they represent probably 50 to 60% of the uranium that is exported every year to France to power their nuclear power plants. Well, without Niger, and Niger is now in the hands of an anti-Western government, they don't have access to that uranium. Now, that may seem small to some people, but it's huge. And we are seen now as having destroyed the flow of ammonia through pipelines to the West. Well, that means you can't develop effective fertilizer. This puts the whole green revolution in much of the world at risk. Because remember, the reason we have this enormous population on the planet in most of the developing world is because Europeans and Americans created the green revolution, the pesticides and the fertilizers that ensure the abundance of food. Well, if they go away, and that's the way it's beginning to look right now, that's going to create havoc and chaos all over Africa, South America, Southeast Asia. The whole thing's a disaster. It needs to stop. It's not about we're winning, they're losing. But he insisted on neutrality because he didn't want to be under attack from those regions where he knows the people are hostile to him. Well, that opportunity is now passed, and he doesn't want to go up there. So I think he is really looking for a way to avoid that, but he has to have a partner. And I think his best bet at this point is for Europeans to do something, to stop behaving as sort of obedient vassals of Greater Washington's empire and start behaving like Germans, like Frenchmen, like Italians. What are their interests? And if you look at their interests, they do not align whatsoever with this war against Russia. They never have. It's only the Poles, really, and to some extent the Lithuanians, maybe the Latvians, I don't know, that have been so violently anti-Russian and have insisted on this, along with Great Britain. Great Britain seems to be ruled by people not very different from the ones that are ruling us right now in Washington, and that's disappointing, but that's not Europe. So the Europeans could forge a different way ahead, and I hope that they do, because I don't see us doing much. Somebody said to me the other night, "What do you think we'll do?" And I said, "Well, go back and look at Vietnam." And I think the Europeans won't tolerate that. They know that could lead to a regional war. That's the whole point. That if you let these Poles and Lithuanians stagger into Western Ukraine, you're essentially setting us up for a regional war. What's to stop the Russians then from saying, fine, we'll hit all the airports, all the airfields, all the storage locations, all the forces in Poland, in Lithuania? I mean, what's to stop them? They can hit them now. That was the point of striking Rennie right there on the border with Romania. So I don't think so. I think the Europeans at that stage, I'd be very surprised if somebody just didn't stand up and say enough's enough. I think it's fair to say that every major crisis or conflict in the history of the United States usually begins in the same way, with amnesia. You have people that categorically dismiss the importance of systematically studying the region where you're going to operate, understanding the potential opponent. There is no interest in other people's interests. Yeah, Washington and the globalist community that is in Europe, ruling today in Germany and France and other places, doesn't care about interests. They are pursuing what they think is an ideological objective: to bring down this Russian state that will not open its borders, that will not abandon its national identity, and essentially prostrate itself before the West, be part of our financial hegemony as well as our military hegemony.
Yep.
That's the easiest way to think of it. Now, you're raising an important point. Somebody somewhere along the line must have had some sense and said, wait a minute, what is your real objective? And they say, well, the real objective is to harm Russia, bring down Putin. Well, it reminds me of Anthony Eden in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. He told Field Marshal Montgomery, who then I think was the chief of the Imperial General Staff, or perhaps he'd already retired at that stage. He said, we're going to go into Egypt. And Montgomery said, why? For what purpose? And he said, to knock Nasser off his perch. And Montgomery said, well, that's absurd. Doesn't make any sense. You know, how do you plan to achieve that? What are you trying to create in the country? Chaos, civil disorder? You want it to disintegrate? Because those are real possibilities based upon what you've just said. And let's set aside a minute whether or not it's actually attainable. Why would the rest of the world sit there while you did this? Obviously it fell on deaf ears. Anthony Eden pressed ahead. They went into the Suez, and what happened? Disaster.
Yep.
The whole thing was a mess. They weren't prepared. They didn't understand what they were dealing with. In that case, they grossly overestimated the Egyptians, but they failed to prepare the groundwork. They didn't have a plan. They didn't know what the specific objectives were other than we want to get rid of Nasser. Well, we're in the same position now. And of course, Anthony Eden was reliving, his views of Hitler in the 1930s, which had absolutely nothing to do with Nasser or the Suez. We are similarly inclined today to see Putin as a Stalinist figure. The Russian army is another Soviet imitation. It's all wrong. It makes no sense.
True.
But I think behind all of it, there are a group of very wealthy people. In the East, you call them oligarchs. We can talk about hedge fund billionaires. They have an interest in getting access to Russia's enormous resources.
Yep.
So whatever they can do to bring down the regime and fragment the country is, in their estimation, monetarily rewarding. Now, that's a sick notion in my judgment.
Yep.
But I think that's also played a role in all of this. And then remember, we Americans don't pay much attention to what happens overseas. Unless you kill 1,000 of us on a particular day somewhere beyond America's borders, Americans don't pay attention.
Okay.
And this has been the problem for 60 years. It's disastrous.
It's true. Because what's happening right now is that we're completely depleting NATO, I think. And as you mentioned in various interviews, I mean, how much breath do we still have being NATO to continue this?
I don't think there's much left. If you go back to an interview that I did with Dimitri Simes in January, actually, I think it was his co-host, George Beebe, former CIA officer. It was in January before this whole thing got started. And they were asking people to make predictions. Well, one of my predictions, like so many others, was wrong. And that was, I said the Russians absolutely go in. I was correct. I said that by the time this is over, NATO will collapse. I said that in January of 2022. Mm-hmm. The one thing that I got wrong, and I think a lot of us did, was that the Russians would go in as carefully, deliberately, and slowly and cautiously as turned out to be the case.
Yep.
Of course, we were not on receipt of the Russian General Staff's instructions from the president. And Putin, who really didn't want a war, who is really trying to do something that you should never do as a head of state, which is, quote unquote, send signals. He was trying to signal the West. He had no idea how corrupt and venal the globalist elites dominating Europe and the United States really were, and how, absolutely outrageously hostile they were. I don't think he ever anticipated that. He thought that once this got started, that people would stand up and say, look, we don't want a war in Europe. I remember when I was an officer in the 1990s, the 1980s, but specifically in the 90s, and then along came the Kosovo Air Campaign, and I stood around talking to some of your colleagues in the Dutch forces, as well as the Germans and the French and others, and they all said privately, we thought NATO existed to prevent the outbreak of another war in Europe, not start one.
Yep.
Well, welcome to reality. This is from the beginning been engineered by Washington with support from London and Paris. And the Europeans are going to pay a terrible price. The sooner they wake up to this reality, and frankly, I think throw us out, the better off they will be. But that's an issue for them to resolve.
But the point is that you probably saw it at the beginning. I saw it at the beginning that Putin went in a way that was not as expected. I mean, I knew that he could roll over Ukraine within 5 seconds. I'm exaggerating, but I mean, it wouldn't have been difficult for him.
Yeah.
And he didn't. So that was, as you say, like signaling, like, this is not what I want. And we didn't react. We reacted in an opposite way. Boris Johnson even blocked a peace offering that could have been on the table, etc., etc. Then we started to send arms, which we are sending completely in vain because the Ukrainians are getting massacred. I mean, your estimate is like 350,000 to even 400,000 dead, and there are even higher estimates. Then we have to calculate with the wounded people. I mean, I think close to 1 million Ukrainian fighting age people are now out of the battlefield. It's incredible. We're getting...
And the thing that's so disturbing to me is that no one seems to care. I know that no one in Washington cares whatsoever. Now, I grew up with Ukrainians in North Philadelphia, and I loved them. I thought they were great people.
Yep.
I also grew up with some Poles and Lithuanians and others. I was the odd man out because I didn't fit into any of those categories. But that's one of the reasons that I ultimately went to Europe to study in Germany. I was so enthralled by the people that I met, and they were equally enthralled with the Germans.
Yep.
And then I became interested because, of course, at the time we were facing the Russians. So, I was trying from the very beginning to understand all of these individuals and all of these people. I'm not sure I ever completely grasped it, but I can tell you one thing with absolute certainty. No one in Washington understands any of it.
Well,
they
don't. The main point is that when I went to Afghanistan, I'm the longest serving military soldier in Afghanistan. And I served for 2 years there. And I was an intelligence officer, but I served outside the gates always. And my point was to live in the heads of our opponents. I mean, that was what I thought was my work, to try to understand them till the very smallest detail. And I tried everything I could to live in their shoes, to walk their walk and to talk their talk, and I succeeded. That way I could properly inform my superiors, which was my job. Right now, I see the exact opposite. So I completely agree with you. We completely don't understand Russian culture and Russian despotism and Russian whatever is there. We simply don't understand it. And we're eating ourselves at this moment. But you mentioned Poland, and in an interview I saw with you, you said something in the gist of what's NATO is doing right now hinges on what the Polish government is doing. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, the government in Warsaw has been very hostile to Russia from the first moment. And they are caught up in this emotional hysteria that on the one hand, Russia is evil and any Russian has to be destroyed. And on the other hand, they see themselves as the inevitable imperial masters of much of Ukraine and Belarusia. I think that's falling apart right now. In fact, I received some information this morning from my friends in Poland telling me that 52% of Poles have now essentially said, we want nothing to do with the war in Ukraine.
Okay.
Some say, well, we'll send support and assistance. But our real interest in Poland right now is to get millions of Ukrainians out of Poland.
Okay.
So that's a big change. So I think it's going to be very hard now for the Poles to be an American stalking horse, because effectively that's what we tried to do with Ukraine. They were a stalking horse. Let's push and push and push, see how far we can go to the border with Russia. And if we can put troops and missiles and equipment out there in the east that will threaten Russia, that's a good thing. Then we can bully Russia. We forgot we weren't dealing with Iraq. We weren't dealing with any of these sort of artificial constructs as opposed to real nation states. Russia is a real place. So, now we're paying a terrible price. But I think we're learning, and I think Americans are learning, because they look and they say, we have so many people in the United States who need help and support. Why are we sending billions to Ukraine? It's a very simplistic formula, but it's working.
Yep, see your point. What will Russia do? I mean, they can't. I mean, if I analyze their actions right now, they're like pushing in small ways. They're advancing their front a little bit. They dig in and they wait for the Ukrainians to come for them, and then they annihilate them. They attack with very small infantry units backed up by tanks. I think they play a very thought out game. It's not so bad what they're doing. What will be the decisive moment that Putin says this is it? Because I read the statements from the Felicius, what was it, the meeting, the NATO meeting we just had, and NATO is still on the same as the same point of view, like Russia's bad and we only accept a total retreat, and that will not happen. So in your opinion, where in the end will this lead? Will they march on to Poland, or, I mean, do you see any perspective here?
Well, keep in mind that the last thing that Vladimir Putin wants is to govern Ukrainians. So he'd rather not cross that river and march west. That was never his plan.
No.
If you look at the areas where the Russian forces are currently sitting, those are historically Russian areas, and that's where the Russian speakers live.
Yep.
He has always said that Kharkov and Odessa would once again be Russian cities. Mm-hmm. So I think that will happen. There's no question about that. I think at the same time, he's watching to see what the West is going to do. He sees Scholz in Berlin in an extremely fragile position. Scholz has an approval rating of about 31%. The German electorate says it wants a new government. I think the Germans have finally discovered that they're not only headed into a deep recession, but they're being deindustrialized. Their scientific industrial power is being destroyed. And again, the Germans are saying, well, we were never really consulted, were we? No one asked us whether or not we wanted to declare war. Instead, you had all these emotional outbursts from, this woman, Baerbock, who is absurd, who refused to shake the hand of Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. It was just childish nonsense. And all of this, Moscow's watching and saying, well, how long before Scholz is gone? How long before Macron is gone? If they can get rid, I'm saying the Europeans, if they can get rid of those two, then I think you may have some governments that will come forward and say that's enough.
Yep.
And then you have Washington, and Washington is stuck in a swamp of its own creation. No one wants to retreat from ridiculous statements and policy positions. No one wants to step forward and say, this is a real mistake. By the way, we lied to you, and we've been lying to you for months. Right now there are 37 Ukrainian brigades, we think roughly 37, all along the defensive line from the southeast, I would say, to the northeast. We think the Ukrainians may have 6 brigades in reserve. 6 brigades amounts to what, 24,000. A little over 100,000 Ukrainians sitting in these defensive positions where obviously they are being hammered on a routine basis and dying every day. At the same time, the Russians have 300,000 troops in reserve. And Putin has always been reluctant to commit that reserve and bring this to a rapid close because he's afraid that we will then suddenly convince everyone in NATO to go into Western Ukraine. And if that happens, then he's got a war in his hands that he really never wanted, but he is then compelled to win it.
Yep.
Can't back away. He can't allow this rump state that may emerge from this experience to be part of NATO. You know, from the very beginning, Ukraine should have been neutral, had no business being part of NATO. He knows that. So I think it's really a matter for decision by Vladimir Putin. And I think he's watching all of these things before he commits forces. And lastly, and I know a lot of people don't believe this, but this is true, he doesn't want to kill any more Ukrainians. They are Slavs and Orthodox Christian Slavs. He's not interested in killing them.
I agree. I predicted a long time ago that more or less what you're saying right now, he would consent to the eastern part of Ukraine, but then what with the western part of Ukraine? I mean, he would still demand neutrality of that part of Ukraine. And
Absolutely.
as I read the last statement of NATO, they're clearly not willing to give him that. So that puts us in a very difficult position. Then I'm with you. Putin doesn't want this war. He doesn't want to kill Ukrainians. He wants to end this yesterday, but obviously he can't. Just to jump to another topic, I mean, the Netherlands were running front to now deliver F-16s to Ukraine. They have not yet been delivered. They have been promised. Denmark did the same. Will that impress Putin in any way?
No. He knows that those F-16s, without airborne warning and control systems, these are the aircraft with extraordinary communications capability and radars. They're the ones that target for all of the aircraft. You're talking about a very complex operation. So this is not going to arrive before this comes to an end, in my judgment. It's not going to change anything. I think it's very foolish.
So do I. First of all, they have to train the pilots, of course, which they will do after they have had a course of 1 month to learn to speak English, which I think is ridiculous. It's true. I'm not joking here. But then we need all the support for those F-16s, and they don't even have a runway long enough to facilitate those aircraft. So these are as well completely ridiculous decisions. I think you said it somewhere that the military genius have been put out of this operation. It's now politicians that decide, and there are no military people any longer involved.
Well, I would be careful not to absolve the senior military leaders of responsibility for the debacle. There were lots of senior officers in NATO, American and British, and possibly others who had very crazy ideas about how to fight. They are living, unfortunately, from what I've seen in the last year of World War II, which they don't even understand. You know, what we're seeing is something very similar to what happened to the Germans in the last year of the war. Yeah. Something Rommel tried very hard to persuade people of, and they wouldn't listen. And that was very simply the following. They didn't have adequate air and missile defenses. And so their armor formations, if they were discovered, were absolutely destroyed by air power, air supremacy, by thousands upon thousands of fighters and bombers. So this is what the Ukrainians face. They don't have the air and missile defense to protect their forces on the ground. So they're in a hopeless position. They are still alive at all because the Russians have chosen not to attack. But when they do, this will be over, I suspect. I just, you know, again, I think Putin is being careful, but he's also looking for opportunity. The thing I worry about is that we will be stupid and think that his reluctance to attack and end this on purely military terms is a sign of weakness. It's not.
I'm with you. The decision of the US to deliver cluster weapons, will that affect, I mean, you said something about that Great Britain, at least, and France and Germany were now like getting a little bit reluctant about that, which will lead probably, hopefully, to some sort of division within NATO. What do you think about that?
Well, my own experience with cluster munitions is that they're very effective against soft targets, human beings, wheeled vehicles, wheeled
Yeah.
armor. They have no impact whatsoever on tanks and other heavy equipment. And they're a nuisance because about 10 to 15% of the time you have duds. That means that you've got to go out and police these things after it's over. And I saw there were many, many injuries after the Gulf War because children, Arabs, went out there and didn't know what they were dealing with and were harmed. And I think that's one of the reasons everybody said, well, this is not worth the investment. We can do business better. But remember, we'd run out of artillery ammunition.
Yep.
We don't have the scientific industrial base that we once did. We don't have a surge capacity.
And then you claim, and you're right, I mean, Russia changed quickly into like a war economy, and they are supplying themselves in a great manner. They're even, as far as I know, right now using kamikaze drones to attack the infantry, Ukrainian infantry. They have unlimited artillery shells, I think they have, and then they have their Kinzhal rockets that they up-produced. Any shortages there?
Well, it's similar to Napoleon when he arrived at Borodino, who was stunned by the fact that the Russian army at Borodino outside of Moscow had more artillery than he did. He was used to encountering opposing forces that had less artillery than he did and didn't know how to employ it. Well, the Russians knew how to do that. All I'm trying to say is that every conceivable miscalculation based on prejudice, stupidity, bad assumptions, emotion, hostility by this small elite that's in charge. Because remember, the average American could care less.
The average
American has been told, oh, Russians are bad. We've been hearing that for 60 years.
Yep.
Now, that's nonsense now. That Russia changed profoundly in the 90s and is absolutely not the Soviet state that it once was. But again, nobody hears that.